Oh, we're live. We're so live. Hey, folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. It is Wednesday, November 20th, 2024. This is Mind Your Banners for Wednesday, November 20th, 2024. Don't mind me while I fold a shirt here on the side. That's a little on-air admin trying to get chores done while we podcast. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. Mike, you were adamant we were leaving basketball completely to one side this week, or well, today anyway. We'll obviously have our post-game podcast after UNC Greensboro tomorrow. But no basketball today, no men's basketball, no women's basketball. I know you were desperate to talk about the soccer tournament starting this weekend, and that's where we're going to go. No. Indiana, Ohio State, the first top 5 regular season matchup in IU history. I would say almost certainly the biggest regular season game in Indiana history, for football. Certainly the biggest, and if you want to call it the modern era. I don't know. Where do we start? Like, just how are you? Like, we've had 2 weeks of build up to this because of Indiana's bye, and Indiana kind of stayed in the news with Curt Cignetti's extension. Just like, how do you process how it seems like from the IU side this game is approaching?
Well, I think they couldn't have asked for like a better culmination to their season. I mean, if you're pitching sort of, look, Scott Dawson's got the football project for the stadium sort of on his plate. They want to raise money for NIL to sort of keep that going. For all sorts of reasons, money kind of drives the bus. You couldn't ask for a better advertisement. Basically, a constant stream of advertisements for 2 weeks about Indiana and Indiana football. In terms of where the program is at now, what they've done in the last 12 months, Curt Cignetti. I mean, really, don't you think that this is like the sort of, Scott, I just can't imagine him just smiling the last 2 weeks just with what's going on.
Do you think he's planted the conversation with Feinbaum? Do you think this is like a no media is bad media kind of situation? Like he's like somebody in the athletics department has set up a burner and is just constantly emailing Kirby Smart. Like, Kirby, did you see this? Kirby, look at another way that Indiana's not worthy, because I have really enjoyed the extent to which, and we'll talk about the game, in a little more depth in a bit, but like, as someone who grew up in the SEC and knows what it looks like when it just means more, I have enjoyed the extent to which IU football has just broken the SEC this year. Like, that conference is incapable of computing what this program has done. And I mean, to the extent that you have sitting U.S. senators complaining about the way Indiana built its roster, I really never thought I would see the day.
Well, it's funny because it's like there's not an SEC team that like stepped up to the plate with any of these players. So like, I mean, he obviously doesn't know anything he's talking about. But like, I mean, they could have easily they could have easily come in and I mean, look, Rourke had 4 teams recruiting him, and one was the SEC. And do you know which one was that from the SEC that recruited Rourke?
Was it Vandy?
Yeah, it was Vanderbilt. So I mean, it's not like
I think I vaguely remembered like hearing that around that time.
Yeah, so all that chatter is. I think the discourse has gone off the rails a little bit. Joey Galloway, I don't understand his point about sitting Curtis Rourke. Some of this is just people. I think you have to view it for the lens of people just filling time, because those are bad, unreasoned sort of takes. But no, I think the SEC is struggling with the idea of an Indiana in the playoff just because they feel like it's a direct, Indiana's stealing their spot. But I don't think anybody that's watched this
not. The SEC is still going to get 4 teams in. Like, the committee has very clearly said it.
Yeah, but I'm saying that's what SEC teams feel. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying anybody that's watched them won't agree with that.
Yeah, I just like it. I mean, there is this cognitive dissonance when you hear Kirby Smart say, well, I don't know what they're looking for. And it's like, well, it seems like they're looking for wins, Kirby. Like, I mean, that, it seems like that's me. That's like me getting pulled over doing 90 right next to the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit sign and going in front of the judge and be like, I didn't know what they were looking for. couldn't really tell you. They need to be clearer with their criteria, or this isn't fair. And like, Doug Lemery over at Kings of the North, Doug had something that I thought, like a theory that I thought was very fair, which is the SEC has this weird dynamic where at any given time, there's usually at least one team, sometimes two, never really more than two, that you look at and you just say, like, listen, okay, maybe they lost this game, or okay, maybe this team's got a better margin of victory, or okay, this team is 10-0 instead of 9-1, or whatever, but you just know they're better. Saban's Alabama teams were that way, where you just sort of said, like, they can beat anybody on any given day, and hey, they lost at Tennessee, or I guess Saban barely ever lost to Tennessee, but they lost at LSU or whatever, or they lost the Iron Bowl. But, like, you covered a season where Auburn physically dominated both Georgia and Alabama, then lost the SEC championship game because they had a bunch of players injured, and then Georgia and Alabama went and played in the national title. Like, there are years where there is a truly dominant or a couple truly dominant teams in the SEC, and then there's some good teams around them, and it is genuinely competitive at the top. But the problem is what happens is the SEC wants that sort of veil of dominance to just be automatically extended out to all the good teams in its conference. And so suddenly it becomes, well, if Georgia's that good, then Tennessee must be that good. And if Tennessee's that good, then Alabama must be that good. And when you have a season like this where, okay, you can throw me Georgia's strength of schedule, or you can point out, that like their losses are largely acceptable or whatever. But you have a season like this where you're either Texas, which is de facto leading the conference right now and hasn't really beaten anybody, and has a loss at home to Georgia, or a slew of 2-loss teams like Ole Miss, which lost at home to Kentucky, like Georgia, which lost to Alabama and to who else? And Ole Miss, and by the way, barely squeaked by Kentucky and was in danger of losing to Florida before Florida's starting quarterback got injured. Like, I'm sorry, at a certain point, you don't just get like an assumed level of credit for past or presumed excellence. And that is what I think the SEC is kind of asking for here in a year where, again, the committee is clearly setting it up to give the ACC one, the Big 12 one, Notre Dame one, the fifth champion one, and then 4 each for the SEC and the Big 10, but that's not enough. And it's just sort of like, come on, like, just take a breath, look in the mirror, and live with it, basically.
Yeah, and I think it'll all get sorted out. And Noah will be happy just because that's how it is. And then they'll say we should expand again and blah blah blah, as Kurt Signetti likes to say. But it's just like Indiana deserves to see the table whether they win this weekend or not. To me, as long as they beat Purdue, which I think we're going to assume. That's the bottom line. I just think that, I think it's the bias of having watched them for 10 weeks or 10 games that, I think this team can play with anybody.
I think, and I want to talk about like the lead into this game in a second, but it is worth mentioning. So I went back and just pulled these numbers, and I'm not going to act like there's some crack research. I just,
Our analytics team.
Yeah, our analytics team was on top of it. If you include 2021 Notre Dame, in the 10 years of the 4-team playoff, either Notre Dame or a Power 5 team finished with 1 loss 10 times and did not make the 4-team field. It is obviously kind of a blunt instrument way of looking at it, but if we just sort of extend the New Year's Six and just say the New Year's Six is like a hypothetical, retroactive 12-team playoff field, every single one of those 10 teams played a New Year's Six game. Not one of those 10 teams was ranked lower than 7th in the committee's final playoff ranking, and that ranking does not come after the bowls; it comes before the bowls. But it's how they put these teams. That's how they sorted these teams out to get them into the New Year's Six games. 2014 Baylor and TCU, 2015 Iowa and Ohio State, 2017 Wisconsin, 2018 Ohio State, 2021 Notre Dame, 23 FSU, 23 Georgia, 23 Ohio State, all finished 5th, 6th, or 7th in the committee's final rankings. So as best we can cite precedent, and this is precedent on shaky ground, but as best we can cite sort of past precedent of how the committee evaluated power conference teams with just one loss. They have never not included one of those teams in their top 8 in the final rankings. Now, obviously that sort of power conference has now broken apart even further, and I think we can see that there's a very good chance that 2 of what people still sort of refer to as the Power 4 may not have a team in the top 10, and they're just going to have to get in by virtue of the automatic bye for their conference. But the point is, this is the way the committee has historically treated one-loss power conference teams. Again, I included Notre Dame there. 10's a nice round number. I think Notre Dame gets some of the same consideration even as an independent. The idea that Indiana could lose this game and get dropped all the way out of the rankings and not be able to play its way in or stay in or whatever, history tells us the committee just doesn't treat it that way.
Yeah, no, and like I said, and I think that sets up what this game is. I mean, we talked about sort of they probably want to avoid a blowout, but we don't sort of. I think both of us are in agreement that don't see it that way. But I'm curious as to what your keys to the game are, or how do you think this kind of game this game shakes out?
I mean, it's tough because there is an awful lot of strength on strength here. It's Ohio State is one of the stingiest red zone defenses in the country. Indiana is probably the most prolific red zone offense in the country. Ohio State has some weaknesses in its secondary, at least in theory. But in the same breath, its corners are prone to some mistakes. Can Indiana, kind of attack that? I think there's a lingering question from the Michigan game around the pass rush and whether that was just kind of a one-game thing that Indiana could get cleaned up, or that was reflective of Indiana maybe struggling when the other team went up an athletic level. I'm bringing this comment in here from Sam Gerber. How impactful is OSU losing their starting center after losing their left tackle a couple weeks ago? So for people who don't know, Ohio State has lost, I think, 2 tackles now. They have a guard, Donovan Jackson, an all Big Ten guard, but he's a guard, not a tackle. He's now out playing tackle. They just lost their center, who suffered an Achilles injury in practice. He's out for the rest of the season, so now they're going to have to shuffle that up. They probably have, my perception is, some more natural replacements for their center, but he was a transfer from Alabama, and he's been really important to just kind of tying the whole line together. Now they've got to replace him. So now you've got the question of Indiana's pass rush against kind of a bit of a patchwork Ohio State offensive line. You obviously have 2 of the best teams in the country in scoring margin, 2 of the best teams in the country in yards per play and yards per play allowed. There are just a lot of different places to start breaking down this matchup that are kind of difficult to parse, because you're either talking about, can Indiana overcome a perceived athletic or talent advantage, or you're talking about real strength on strength. And I could, if you simulated this game 1,000 times, there aren't many outcomes you'd have a hard time convincing me are possible, because I see so many different directions this game can go.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned weaknesses in their secondary. I mean, on paper, they're been really good this season. They're ranked 6th in the country in passing defense. Have only allowed over 200 passing yards twice this season, and once was 201. So really only one time. And the only time they've struggled against the pass this season has been against Oregon. Only allowed 4 passing touchdowns to 7 interceptions. Still do get pretty good pressure, ranked 14th in sacks in the country, just 1 less than Indiana. So, statistically speaking, they've been very good against the pass, and nobody's really tested them other than Dylan Gabriel, who had 341 yards and completed about 67% of his passes. I mean, the worst Indiana's passing game looked the entire season was that second half against Michigan. Obviously, I think we'll need to be better. or at least need to have at least one half where they sort of generate the production they did. Because they set themselves up well in that game by the kind of the explosive plays they had early. So I think that to me is a key. Obviously, they've got Caleb Downs in the back end. One of the more talented players in the country. I just think
that's one where I wonder, because like Indiana likes these little sort of like 2-man combos where like one side of the field is like quick timing, one read, pre-snap read stuff, and the other side is kind of like these sort of like zone buster route combinations where it's like you send somebody straight up the seam and then you run a post route over top of that, and that forces like the safety to make a choice basically. But like if the safety's Caleb Downs, can you do that? Can you do you feel good throwing over the middle of the field, which is a place where Indiana has really liked to go. It's not easy to throw over the middle, but the teams that can do it, it's a big weapon to have because college teams don't tend to be able to guard the middle very well. You don't have the talent level you have at the NFL. B, not a lot of quarterbacks can make those throws. One of the things that's actually turned a lot of NFL scouts on to Curtis Rourke this season, my impression anyway, has been his ability to work the middle of the field between the hashes and not be afraid of it, not be shy about throwing the ball there. I just wonder, like, when you have one of the best safeties in the country back there, maybe the best safety in the country back there, do you shy away from any of that? Do you have to do anything different to try and challenge Caleb Downs? Obviously, then you're asking, like, what is Ohio State doing coverage-wise? I'm interested to see if Indiana can take any of those shots. Penn State really didn't seem to, but I don't know that Penn State's offense is designed for that the way Indiana's is. So, like, I'm not sure if that's, like, a fair comparison point or not.
Yeah, and we talked about that the run game's sort of been a little bit Jekyll and Hyde. I feel like this season, especially against power conference opponents, struggled a little bit the last 2 weeks, and obviously Michigan's defensive front, shut them down completely. 28 carries, 40 yards, 1.4 yards per carry. And Justin Ellison really only had a couple carries in the second half of that game and was banged up. I think it's going to be important that they sort of keep him honest a little bit there, which they haven't been able to really do the last 2 weeks, really since, Washington, when, volume sort of was the key there, just that they ran the ball 52 times. But I'd like to, you'd like to see them run a little bit more effectively, because I think some of those, even though it wasn't gaudy numbers, they were like, Justice Ellison, I looked up the other day, has is one away from like the most 10 runs of 10 yards or more since like 2018 for IU for any running back. And just those kind of bursts have, I think, been really important in keeping defenses honest. Even when they haven't had sort of the overall, consistent success, they've at least had those sort of explosive runs. And I think those we haven't seen that much the last 2 weeks.
I put a comment up here from Matt Kay that said the only stat disparity that's glaring is in red zone scoring defense. Indiana is 87th and Ohio State is first. But like, I actually
how many trips have IU allowed? I mean, isn't it very?
That's why I wanted to highlight it, is because Indiana has, if you look at score percentage, which is the percentage of opponent red zone possessions that end in scores, Indiana's 14th in the conference. If you look at like touchdown percentage, which is obviously the percentage of touchdowns, the red zone positions in touchdowns, opponent red zone touchdown percentage, Indiana's 8th in the conference, which is obviously pretty much middle of the road. But the flip side is Indiana has allowed the fewest red zone attempts in the conference at 22, and the third fewest, or tied for the third fewest scores overall. They've allowed the third fewest touchdowns. They are in the. It's nobody's allowed that many field goals, so like there's a whole bunch of like 4-way ties and whatever. The point is, I think what this highlights is, I understand what Matt's saying. The one big question that like blankets over all of this is we just haven't seen Indiana pushed, because we haven't. Well, we have not that we haven't seen Indiana pushed.
Well,
we haven't seen Indiana play a team like this, and so we look at these numbers. And like the reason some of those numbers look bad for Indiana in the red zone specifically is because Indiana's just not allowing a lot of red zone possessions. Is that a function of how good Indiana is, or is that a function of who Indiana's played? We can kind of extend that out to a lot of different conversations around this game. And I think why a lot of people are fascinated by this game, including me, is it feels like it's like, not to be too reductive, but it's going to give us a sense for exactly where Indiana's level is in a way that we thought Nebraska might, but it turned out they couldn't. We thought Michigan might, but no. We thought Washington might, but not really. You can't really fake, for better or worse, Ohio State. And
no, but I think I mean, I would, I mean, it's parts of the roster. We don't have to break it down, but Michigan's defensive line is by far the best in the Big Ten. So I don't know that,
I think they're better. I think Ohio State's defense is better, but I think Michigan's defensive line is better.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think it's like, this is going to be like just a total shock. And in terms of kind of flipping over, one thing that I thought was interesting, I didn't ask the question well to Kurt Signetti, and I asked it better to Aiden Fisher, and I got the answer I was looking for. Is that is Indiana benefiting on defense from the second year with Bryant Haynes? Is he throwing more at these guys, and are they benefiting from that specifically? And Aiden Fisher said yes, that he's throwing a lot more on their plate, and part of that is the thing that hurt Michigan. That Michigan coach Ron Moore said they just really struggled with were those stunts. And I think you mentioned we talked a little bit about sort of the movement up front. And that is part of what has increased this year in terms of like how much they're putting in on a weekly basis. And part of that is because they've had what I think is like 7 returning starters on defense from JMU. And so that to me is interesting because I think that's been sort of one of the keys to this run. And, we talked to the offensive line. It's got multiple injuries for Ohio State. That defensive front, I think, has been like the definition of their success this year for Indiana. And what they've been doing coaching and play and talent, I think it's a combination. And I think we've seen that to me is the area where I think it could determine how, if Indiana can win this game on Saturday. If they pressure them 60% of the time again, they're going to be in this game.
Well, I would add something onto that. If they pressure them 60% of the time with a 4-man rush, because I think if there is like an area where I think Ohio State is at least going to have an advantage early on, Indiana's not seen anything like Ohio State's skill positions offensively. Now, I think Indiana can adjust to that. I think Indiana can handle that. I was like today years old when I realized that D'Angelo Pons and Jeremiah Smith went to high school together. Did you know that?
That would have been good to know.
Yeah, I know. I'm double checking this, but this is what I did. I did an Ohio State podcast, and they mentioned it on there. Indeed, they both went to Chaminade Madonna down in Florida. I think IU can adjust, but I suspect there's going to be some system shock, if nothing else, early on in this game. And Indiana's got to be in a position where that 4-man rush stays pretty consistent, both against the pass. It's also worth saying Indiana's allowing the fewest yards per rush in the conference. And again, have they faced a rushing attack that's got Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins? They've not faced any teams that run the ball particularly well. So it's another one of these where it's where's the inflection point between Indiana's performances being a function of who they played and Indiana's performances being a function of their talent, their skill, their ability. But the longer that front can hold up with just 4, the more that lets Bryant Haynes and the defensive staff get creative about how they manage some of these skill spots. Egbuka's his numbers in games against top 5 or top 10 opponents are nuts. He rises to his best level at these games. Obviously, Jeremiah Smith is really good. Again, multiple running backs that can hurt you. That front 4 has got to be able to stay stout without needing a bunch of help from the players, the levels behind it. Because I don't think Indiana can wind up in a situation where it's got to start committing extra bodies to the run or the pass rush or anything like that.
Well, and I think they've been, because I thought, and I've said this multiple times and apologized, that they'd have to blitz a lot to have the success that they are having. But I mean, they have not, and they've been very strategic about it. They pulled back a little bit against Michigan. Only blitzed, per Football Focus, 11 out of the 34 dropbacks. So we're very careful of it, and they never that number never really goes above 50%. I mean, they've been very strategic about when they bring pressure, where they bring it from. So it hasn't been like, you look at their numbers and be like, oh, they must be just, blitzing the heck out of teams, and they're just not. And it's, it's mostly come from that front four. So yeah, I mean, the one way to make sure a team doesn't have time to get the ball to their skill players is by, generating the pressure that Indiana has, and that sets themselves up well for giving them a chance because, Kamara, and I think particularly the last couple of weeks, their interior of the line has played the best they have all season in terms of James Carpenter and CJ West. And I think that's paid huge dividends for for stopping people.
Well, for stopping the run in particular, and putting teams in positions where they are going to have to throw the ball. And Ohio State is not. I mean, there are teams that throw the ball a lot more than Ohio State does. Like Ohio State, if you look at, I've cited Curtis Rourke's attempts per game number as evidence of his efficiency this season. He averages 26.4 attempts per game. Will Howard only averages 25.5. I mean, it is not an offense that leans kind of hard one way or the other. They've been not necessarily elite running the football, but they've been one of the best teams in the conference running the football, one of the most effective teams in the conference. Again, though, they average 35 rushing attempts per game. That's 8th in the Big Ten. They're pretty balanced there. You've got to be able to take one or the other away is kind of my point. And if you can do that with the front four, which is what Indiana's been able to do so much this season, that's when I think some of this starts to bend a little bit more in Indiana's direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I think they got good news in terms of Indiana got good news of being healthy this game. I think that's a big deal. I think if they would have been, I think Miles Price is an important kind of piece for them. I think Justice Ellison, having him 100%. Now, obviously, you're not going to get Drew Evans back, but they can't afford any sort of more injuries on the offensive line. We've talked about them being sort of thin up front all season. Now they're at their limit, right? They could afford one injury. And so now you kind of look at that and you probably, I think they're holding their breath a little bit because, Austin Barrett, maybe is next man, they're really thin. They've nobody with experience behind Taylor Stevens that's available to sort of step in and play. So that's probably an area where you're going to be watching the next 2 weeks, really hoping that they can stay healthy because they're out of depth, at offensive line.
No, that's fair. And I mean, listen, Kurt Cignetti said this, and I think it's kind of underscored by Ohio State's latest injury. Everybody's a little banged up. Everybody's got to solve some problems. I think it's very relevant what you say that it seems like Indiana's probably about as healthy as it's going to be, as it can reasonably be going into a Week 11 game. That's even another couple of weeks for Curtis Rourke's thumb to keep healing. I know he said he's at or near 100% and whatever, but, it can't hurt. When we talk about guys that are important in this game, you mentioned Miles Price. I would also mention Keyshawn Williams. I just think, I think this is going to be a game where Indiana is going to have to pass to run. And I don't necessarily even mean that they pass the ball and that opens up the run, but I mean more like the idea that the passing game sort of becomes a de facto run game. And Price and Williams and a little bit Miles Cross are the guys that are so good at that short and intermediate, sort of range and routes. They're really good getting to the edge quickly. They're really good in the screen and the swing game. They're really good with those quick timing routes, yards after catch, that kind of stuff. Obviously, Keyshawn Williams is honestly one of the hardest runners on the team. I think that's probably fair to say, among all skill players. You think about that run he had against Northwestern, you're going to need some of that too. You're going to need to be able to break through some tackles. When people say who are the most important players in this matchup, there are some that are obvious, the tackles and Curtis Rourke and Elijah Surratt, or on defense it's Kamara, it's West, it's Carpenter, it's Fisher, it's Walker, it's Pons. But if you're looking for sort of under the radar guys, I would look at some of those receivers that make the short to intermediate passing game work, because I think Indiana is going to need that to have offensive success in this game.
Yeah, and I wonder if they'll, try some newer things or break out some things that they haven't needed to. Like Zach Horton's been sort of a not underappreciated, because I think he gets a lot of appreciation, especially from opposing coaches and pundits that watch film because of his sort of toughness and blocking. But they haven't used it much in the receiving game. And when you watch the spring game, you thought, man, this guy's going to have 50 catches and sort of be involved, on a down-to-down basis. And they really haven't. They've really kind of used him sparingly, and he's been more of that blocking guy. And so I wonder if they try some different things, like go to some tight end stuff where try to create some matchups for him, because I think he's sort of been, and he had talked about I'm okay with not getting many catches. I'm fine with my role, but I think he's capable of more and trying something, because this is they've had 2 weeks to sort of come up with the game plan. They've had a lot of time to watch film. What new thing do they sort of break out to try to, confuse Ohio State? And that's just one guy where I think, could have some things in store, just because they haven't used him very much this season in the passing game.
I'm also just kind of so I did a quick podcast that'll be out later this week with Bill Rabinowitz, who's my opposite number at the Columbus Dispatch. And Bill kind of likened, he said, and Bill's covered Ohio State for a long, long time. And he said, listen, this Ohio State is a lot of what you'd expect from Ohio State, very talented, deep, some real playmakers on both sides of the ball. He said maybe one of the big differences profile wise is there's not necessarily that Chase Young, Joey Bosa player defensively that can just absolutely, sort of hand grenade a game, playing in the backfield all the time, quarterback pressures, run stuffs, that kind of thing. But there's still draft picks and there's still, NFL prospects on both sides of the ball. But he said something interesting about Ohio State, because it was sort of and I've gotten to see Ohio State play probably, bits of a handful of games this season, maybe a half dozen. It enunciated what I've been trying to sort of figure out how to say about Ohio State all year. He compared them to a basketball team that will trade baskets for 10 minutes and then go on a 16-0 run. And you'll say where did that come from? Why can't you do that for all 20 minutes and a half or all 40 minutes in a game? But it's more that basically in moments, in bursts, Ohio State looks like what you think Ohio State should look like, the way they move the ball, their execution, their skill, their athleticism, their talent. But then there will always be little hiccups that will slow them down. And I think for Indiana, there's going to be an extent to which winning this game is about identifying the moments when Ohio State's weak and scoring. You can't just be kind of chasing, constantly just sort of letting Ohio State pull the lead out to 10, then get it back to 7 or get it back to 3. I think you've got to see opportunities, especially early, where maybe it feels like Ohio State is in one of those weird lulls that it gets into, particularly offensively, and kind of try to take a shot. I think Indiana, it's interesting you bring up the idea of maybe breaking some stuff out they haven't done before, some stuff that maybe they were saving for, if not necessarily Ohio State specifically, a game more like this where they felt like they needed to be more creative to compete and win. Is there anything Indiana feels like it can almost, not like a trick play, but anything Indiana can kind of confuse Ohio State with? Because it does seem like there are ways in which Ohio State is sort of vulnerable to just these periods in games where it suddenly feels like they've kind of lost their way and they're struggling to find it again.
Yeah, and I mean, the first half Indiana hasn't really, other than that first quarter at Michigan State, struggled to get on the board and sort of play from ahead. And so I think that's been sort of a hallmark of their success this season, that they've been a really, really, really good first half team. They've been a really good fourth quarter team too, which obviously helps. I mean, they've been a good team. But just statistically being able to sort of play from the lead all the time, score touchdowns early, at least in the first quarter in almost every game, I think except 2. They just haven't had a problem with that. And I think that's been a big part of sort of getting them in a rhythm and helping them sort of dictate these games. And, like you said, there'd be no bigger place to do it than this weekend against Ohio State. You saw it last weekend. They almost buckled against Northwestern. No, you texted me that when they were down 7-0. But I think it will be important to sort of make a stamp and say, we're here and we're going to push you to do that early.
There's another piece to this, and I would like to think my record speaks for itself in not playing into the cliches too much. I think we've all been guilty of underestimating this team this year. I mean, you picked them to win 7-8 with the bowl game. I picked them to win 8-9 with the bowl game, and we were both short of what this team was capable of. It is interesting to me, Bill said, based on like some comments that like Ryan Day made, Will Howard made, I think Jim Knowles was the other one who talked. Like, he said his opinion is that Indiana has Ohio State's full attention. But it is interesting to me from the Indiana side of this matchup, like so much of the conversation around this game begins with, when Indiana loses to Ohio State, then what happens? And I know that like some of that
was you did. That was the premise of the story you wrote.
Well, no, that was bracketology. That was just breaking out what might happen.
No, you're guilty. Like this, you're saying. Are you blaming others?
Hold on.
Right.
It's not news that I am the SEC deep state. Okay, like I'm not. Like it's not new news that I'm actually just a plant for the Southeastern Conference. I've been up here for 20 years. And they finally activated me. Like I'm the Russian spies from the Americans. They finally sent me the code word, and I'm active. But like, in all seriousness, I understand that there's an element of that is just kind of animated by like Paul Feinbaum and like Kirby Smart and everything kind of the SEC stuff we talked about earlier. But I am struck by just like that is the national perception of this game. Like whenever I hear anyone talk about this game, I hear them talk as though like there's sort of like a token, hey, Indiana can win. Indiana can absolutely win this game. And then the conversation always shifts over to, and then when they don't, how are we going to handle Indiana? And like that is not a good enough Ohio State team for me to think that they won't be affected at all by that. Does that make sense? Like there have been Ohio State teams that had that level, just that level of excellence that you just thought if they're going to lose, it's going to be to Alabama in the semifinal or whatever. They just cannot be, sort of stopped or contained enough. I'm not sure this Ohio State team is quite that good. And I am at the risk of turning this all into like brand bias bulletin board material. Surprised and curious to see how it affects this game, the extent to which this matchup has been colored by the assumption that at the end of the day, Ohio State is just going to win.
Yeah, I don't know.
John accusing me of backpedaling. He's gonna find out. We'll put it up here right now, John. You're gonna find out just how forward pedaled I've been all week long in a few minutes. Don't you?
I don't know what that means. But,
don't you worry.
I don't think whatever the national perception of is and what of the punditry of it all and social media, I don't think it gets to the locker room much. I think a lot of these guys have turned off their social media, for the season. I know Curtis Rourke has. I don't think they're sort of playing those games. I think what you see from the locker room is, I think was the most noteworthy comment Kurt Cignetti made, and I was writing about this today, that, look, most of my coaches and most of my players starting have won 24 of their last 25 games. They don't know losing, right? They don't find losing acceptable. I'm adding that second part, but the idea that, Ohio State's lost more games in the last 12 months than any of these JMU players have or any of these JMU coaches have. So I think they view it like that they're not an underdog. I think that they've had that chip on their shoulder all season. Kurt Cignetti's played into it. And I think that the locker room is sort of focused on, Kurt Cignetti keeps making fun of people calling it a historic game. He's like, a historic game, it's just the next game. And I think that's cute and, obviously not true.
Well, let me ask you this. I think
they've done a good job of keeping that the chip on the shoulder fuels them, but also the last 2 years, those JMU guys especially have known how to win regardless of the
they don't
circumstances.
get consumed by it. Like Kurt Cignetti has said earlier in the season, like you can become a self-fulfilling prophecy where if you just kind of get too much into the underdog mode, suddenly you start believing you're the underdog and that stuff, kind of builds on itself. What I would argue though is, and you and I have both kind of shied away from the idea of brand bias when talking about Indiana a lot this season, not completely, but in a lot of situations. The line right now, as I've seen it, is like somewhere between 13 and 14, 13 and a half, something like that. What would the line be if this were the Michigan-Ohio State game? And I don't mean this year's Michigan. I mean, if you took Indiana's resume and its coach and its players and you put them in Michigan uniforms, and Michigan had been playing these games all year long, and on the one hand, you said the strength of schedule stinks. They haven't played anybody yet. This is their first meaningful playoff level test. But on the other hand, it was Michigan and not Ohio State. What would the line be? Because I do not think it would be 13 and a half. I don't think it would be close. I think it might be a touchdown at best. And that is where, again, it's a fine line that Kurt Cignetti seems capable of walking between, as you talk about keeping the chip on the shoulder, I'm pointing to my shoulder, the chip's right here. It's right here if anybody needs to know where it is. But keeping an edge to his team without letting his team just kind of get so consumed by it that it becomes destructive or distracting. But I do think this game's a little different because I get
they don't do that. That's not what he does. That's not
what he does to you and me.
I don't think he does it. I think that's I from everything we've been told about him and everybody we've talked
to. Reverse the flow then. What about Ohio State? Because
to your point, last year
all the talk about Ryan Day going into the Penn State game was Ryan Day doesn't win these games. This is why Ohio State fans are frustrated with Ryan Day. I have heard none of that discussion around this game. Like the whole idea that what is it like his record against top 5 teams or top 10 teams is terrible. And I think a lot of that is colored by how he struggled against Michigan in the last few years. And that's obviously going to happen in a rivalry that fierce. But that's the knock on Ryan Day is that he doesn't win enough of these games. And the whole thing around the Penn State game, and he said, we were a team at a crossroads. I was surprised when he kind of said that kind of boldly or honestly. But he just talked about we needed that game and we got it. And like I said, we were a team at a crossroads is the term that he used. It is striking to me that no one is discussing this game as the sort of game that Ryan Day's Ohio State has struggled in recent years to win. And again, maybe Indiana doesn't hear that. Maybe only, but if Ohio State, I find it hard to believe that it doesn't affect the game in some way because it just feels to me and listen, I'm going to ask you for a prediction in a minute and I will explain mine. But part of my reasoning to get where I got to is I get very nervous when games involving college athletes in particular who are younger and a little less mature and a little more prone to mistakes and a little more imperfect, they seem even, and yet the outcome is so assumed. Does that make sense?
Sure. So I'll say for a couple things. The spread to the Ohio State-Michigan game last year, I'm not sure where that was. That in Ann Arbor?
It was. I think it was in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, it's at Ann Arbor was -3, and Michigan was a 3-point favorite. I don't know what that does to your point, but maybe if it wasn't Indiana, if it was Michigan, it'd be 7 points. But I will say they've had a hard time gauging Indiana all season. They're 8-2 against the spread and have beat it by an average of 14.5 points. So they've sort of undervalued, I guess, what they've done all season, and Indiana's sort of obviously blown everybody out. So that's not sort of necessarily a new thing for this week's game, right? And so
it's just more magnified when it's number 2 Ohio State against number 5 Indiana, and it's sort of everybody's going to look at it as now we finally find out how good Indiana is. And I remember joking with you after week 4 or week 5 that we were going to get to the national title game and they're going to be playing
how good is
Georgia. They'd be like, all right, now we're going to find out how good Indiana is. But like, I just, like I said, if there's so much about the narrative and the conversation around this game, whether we are talking about betting lines, spreads, perception, again, like the fact that no one's bringing up that Ohio State fans had just decided Ryan Day didn't win big games before he went to Penn State and beat a coach whose fans have also decided he doesn't win big games. Like, there's been really no talk about that at all. It is all just kind of implied or assumed the outcome before the ball's kicked. And I would not underestimate this group. That is what I would say.
No, and I think the overwhelming being Ohio State being an overwhelming favorite is not necessarily in most circles. I don't know, in all, but like not all national pundits probably have a view. But I don't think it's not saying that they can't compete or they won't make it a game. Or at least that's been the tenor to me. That I don't think it's gone that far. That I do think that there's an assumption that the Ohio State's a favorite, but I mean they're at home.
I'm not saying they shouldn't be a favorite. More like the way
on paper, I mean, they do have the they do have the more. I mean, they have the more talented roster. I think from top to bottom, just talent alone. The NFL. I don't know what the measuring stick is, but I mean, they're going to have more first round guys, more guys drafted. Whatever. I don't know what the metric is because not 5-star. Because obviously, every 5-star doesn't develop. But I mean, like in terms of like what they churn out in terms of NFL level talent of this specific roster, I think will be higher than Indiana's, and
no doubt.
Maybe some of Indiana's guys will play them down the line. But I just feel like that's where it is. I don't know necessarily
the deepest roster in the aggregate in the country. It probably has an argument. Yeah,
I mean they were competing for like their transfer pool targets were a little different than everybody else. They're like, what's the best player at every position?
Right. So, they were taking Kansas State starting quarterback and Alabama starting center. I mean, like I'm not disputing the talent. It's more like, and so
I'm saying that's where for every game they should have a built-in advantage. In terms of maybe with the exception of Oregon because they're at the same level of at the same level of talent that Ohio State should be 10-point favorites over everybody.
And I recognize like why they are. I recognize where the game's played and all those factors. It's just. When Ohio State played at Penn State, an enormous amount was made of Ryan Day's record against top 5 teams. Like that was, and the fact that like James Franklin, I keep backing up from the computer here, that like James Franklin had struggled in those games, Ryan Day had struggled in those games. It was, it was kind of a movable force meets.
It seems like you're more frustrated. Ryan Day's seat isn't warmer. Like this seems
no,
like
that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is
Ryan Day discussion.
What I'm saying is. Again, going back to the idea, if Indiana were wearing somebody else's uniforms, I suspect we would be asking if there was pressure on Ohio State to win this game. And, like Bill Rabinowitz has covered Ohio State for a long time. Bill said he thinks it's kind of a lose-lose for Ohio State. And I'm not sure I agree with that because he says basically if Ohio State beats Indiana, they were favored to do it. Nobody gives them any credit for it. I think it probably depends how that outcome occurred. And if Ohio State loses, the sky is falling. But like people have not kind of considered that as a possibility to me at a level that maybe we get there and we find out that like we were too close to it. The national perception was right. Indiana's a really good team, but it's a cut below the best in the conference, the best in the country. Ohio State controls that game. They win 45-20 and it's never really in doubt. And maybe I'm completely off base. I think that people would be seeing this matchup very differently if they didn't have to overcome whatever built-in doubts they have about Indiana, not as a team, but as a program. And I find it hard to believe that that's not going to somehow color at least some of what happens on the field Saturday. That is my point.
I just don't understand how it spills over the field because the Ohio State players buy into the fact that there should be favorites.
Maybe.
I don't know.
I mean, Ryan Day's 3-6 against top 5 teams.
It seems like more of a discussion of Ohio State's sort of psyche than it does Indiana.
Mind your Ohio State banners.
Yeah, it's like how are they going to handle success? Like I don't know Ohio State. Like I don't know what they've been, how Ryan Day approaches that. Like I just
tomorrow is
feel
a
like,
concept? Do you think tomorrow is a concept in Columbus?
I feel like we've seen enough of Indiana to know that tomorrow's not guaranteed, right? That message has
But
sank
is
in.
it guaranteed in Columbus?
Right, we don't know. I don't have any idea.
In Columbus, do you play every play the same? 6 seconds of play, every play has a life of its own.
But I mean, maybe what your point really is that Kurt Cignetti got an advantage, that he's the difference, right? That
all right.
Maybe you trust him more than you do Ryan Day. Is that maybe what deep down is what your heart is saying?
So basically, I picked Indiana to win.
Okay. And where is this pick? Is this in?
I do an annual Q&A with 11 Warriors, which is an Ohio State, like a long-standing Ohio State website, independent coverage website. And I also gave Bill a pick. Bill always asked me for a little brief and a final score.
Were they the same?
Were they the same? Indiana 31-30. I saw Huberazzi said earlier he thinks it's going to be a lower scoring game. I think if it's a low scoring game, I don't think that favors Indiana. Not that they can't win that way, but I think Indiana's going to have a better opportunity to win this game if there's a point in the game when it opens up a little bit and the offenses get going and you feel like you can get Curtis Rourke in some rhythm, and that if it's still close in the fourth quarter, Indiana has been arguably the best fourth quarter team in the country. I think at the beginning of the season, I said I was picking Indiana to win these games that I picked because I thought Indiana had an advantage at coach, at quarterback, some combination of coach, quarterback, and home field advantage. They will not have home field advantage. I think they have the better coach, and it's not far apart, but I think they have the better quarterback. And that to me, against an Ohio State team that in aggregate talent is great, and if this were a computer simulation and we could say their overall offense, defense, special teams ratings are these, they would beat Indiana, 99 out of 100 times or whatever. But an Ohio State team that I have seen just look sluggish enough, just mistake prone enough, just that little bit not quite elite. I think Kurt Cignetti with a bye week, and to your point about the sort of winning habit that has sort of gripped his program here, Indiana 31, Ohio State 30. And everywhere I have said that or written that, I have said the store will be open for all receipts to be returned on Sunday. If anybody wants to come back at me, I'll own it. Indiana 31, Ohio State 30.
Yeah, I usually make my picks. What was it? Take Wednesday. I usually make them later tonight when I'm writing my preview story. So I didn't have this ready, but my gut says Ohio State like 28, Indiana 17. They cover. It's less than a 10-point game. They're in it, but that Ohio State, like you said, that home field advantage, I do think is not insignificant. This isn't a team that has. I mean, they played well on the road, but they haven't played a lot on the road. Only 3 road games to this point this season. And Ohio State's got some superstars on their team, and I do think that is something that. Michigan was missing their best player last week, the corner. They still, that defense did make a difference and slowed Indiana down. And so I think that does matter in these games. Obviously it'll be contingent on Will Howard getting Jeremiah Smith and some of their receivers the ball. Curtis Rourke, I don't think is going to be completely shut down. And I think they have offensive scheme and offensive minds on offense. And Mike Shanahan and Tino Sansari and Kurt Cignetti that are very good at finding weaknesses. But at the end of the day, on the road, it's reluctant to pick them. I wouldn't be surprised if it's flipped. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the score you said and teams, offense runs the day. But right now, that's where I'm leaning. I reserve the right to change it tonight when I spend some more time thinking about it. But that's where I'm at right now. But like you said, I do think that coaching thing is not to be underestimated. That I think that's made a real difference multiple times this season, where you've seen these first-year coaches. Deshaun Foster's figure some things out, but I thought you saw in that game he did not have a grasp on his team as of yet and what he wanted to do. Kurt Cignetti is not coming here like that. He's not a first-year coach. And so I think you've seen those things at times this year, but you saw it against Michigan. And so I do agree with you at that point that could be the difference in this game. And if it comes down to a final 2 minutes, I would very much want Kurt Cignetti on my sideline as opposed to Ryan Day running my 2 minute sort of calling the plays in offense.
I agree with that. Any other business?
Well, I mean, I have to mention it since I spent so much time on this. I did.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
2-part story on Curtis Rourke. The second part came out today. It's a lot of words, so I know you don't want to read all of them. At least click on and read some of them. First part is on his really just the last 12 months, how he got to IU, his path sort of specifically through the transfer portal, and how he won the job. And then the part today was about his journey. He's obviously a Canadian quarterback. Really, a lot of his success early in his career, and the doors opening were because of his brother Nathan. And here's a fun thing that I've not seen out there was in my story today. Nathan and Curtis are Nathan's 2 years older. He went to the CFL for a couple years, bounced around the NFL, and now is back in the CFL. Has not seen a game of Curtis's, a game that he started. They were teammates for 1 year. Curtis only played a handful of snaps. Has not seen one of his starts. Going back to his upper years as an upperclassman in high school, when he was at Holy Trinity, Curtis was. This will be the first start. He's going to be at the Ohio State game. So this will be the first time he's in the stands for one of his brother's starts, which I think is pretty cool and meaningful because they both played at Ohio. And Nathan was kind of joking that they go to their own games and see Ohio State gear, and his reaction was, "Damn, can't you wear green for one night?" So they've been used to being in the shadow of Ohio State. So that's a long way of saying, please read the stories.
It sounds like the sort of magical narrative moment that would culminate on the field at the Horseshoe when Indiana wins 31-30, and Paul Feinbaum has to walk out and present the SEC championship trophy to Kurt Cignetti, who then declines it, doesn't want it, sends it back.
But it also, in the first part, I got to look up his name. So there's some sliding door moments in there in terms of like what if. The first one is Wake Forest had Curtis Rourke set up to visit their campus before Indiana and took a commitment from their quarterback now, was it Hank Bachmeier, and then called Curtis and canceled the visit. And so Indiana called and was like, "We want you on campus right now. Let's get you down here." So what if Wake Forest gets him on campus first? And you know that they locked down his commitment. That's an interesting sort of what if. And then the other one, Kurt Cignetti wouldn't tell me who, but they did have mobile quarterback in mind that they kicked the tires on and thought about before landing on Curtis. And that would have been, he said that was a much different quarterback in terms of like skill set. And to see a mobile quarterback that they pick instead of Curtis would have been sort of an interesting what if as well. And highlights in the future that they're not going to be constrained to sort of pocket passer versus a dual threat guy.
That's interesting because like Tom Allen said for 7 years that he wanted a dual threat quarterback. And for 7 years, he kept recruiting guys like Brendan Sorsby and Connor Bazelak. Anyway, guys that just like, okay, they could run if you needed them to, but like they were pocket quarterbacks first and foremost. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for the 60 odd people that joined in. These streams keep getting bigger. We will be back tomorrow night with a post game UNC Greensboro podcast. That one will not go as long as this one. I'm confident in saying. And then obviously we will have all the attendant coverage from Columbus on Saturday. Mike and I'll be headed over. In the meantime, HeraldTimesOnline.com for that 2-parter on Curtis Rourke. I've read part 1 and part of part 2. It is out. Read all the words. I think read all the words. I say read all the words because I think they are all very good. And go to IndyStar.com/sports and HeraldTimesOnline.com for all of the pregame build-up coverage. Everything you've come to expect, everything you could want. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for listening. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners. We'll talk to you soon.